Right now, there is a message in your energy that you didn't consciously notice. It didn't come through your phone, it didn't come through words, but something in you just shifted, didn't it? Because what you're feeling is not random. It's the echo of someone thinking about you, deeply, quietly, unmistakably. And if you ignore it now, you might miss the way your own heart is trying to translate it. Have you ever noticed how certain thoughts arrive without permission? One moment you're calm, and suddenly a person appears in your mind like a memory that refuses to fade. It doesn't always mean they are doing something, but it often means your inner world is aligning something you haven't fully understood yet. There is a layer of experience where emotion becomes symbolic, where longing feels like guidance, and silence feels like a message waiting to be decoded. And tonight, that layer feels louder than usual. Something within you is trying to point toward a connection that hasn't fully formed in words yet, but already exists in feeling. Some experiences feel like signals from outside, but they often begin as subtle movements inside the mind that are so quiet we don't immediately recognize them as our own. When you think of hidden emotional signals, it's not about literal messages floating in the air or any external force sending you information. It's about the way the human psyche constantly processes emotional memory, desire, fear, and expectation beneath the level of awareness. A person can feel suddenly touched by a thought of someone, and it seems to arrive out of nowhere, yet it is usually the result of accumulated impressions that have been building for days, weeks, or even longer, without conscious attention. The mind stores emotional experiences not only as clear memories, but as patterns of association. A sound, a time of day, a certain silence, or even a passing thought can activate these patterns, creating the sensation that something meaningful has just arrived. This is why emotional signals often feel external, even though they are generated internally. The unconscious part of the mind communicates in fragments rather than direct statements, so it uses feelings, images, and sudden shifts in mood instead of clear language. When these fragments rise to awareness, they can feel like a message because they carry emotional charge without obvious origin. In relationships and longing, this becomes even more intense. When someone occupies emotional space in your inner world, your mind continues to simulate their presence, even in their absence. That simulation can feel like connection because the emotional circuitry involved does not distinguish sharply between memory and immediacy. So a thought about a person can carry warmth, urgency, or curiosity that feels like it belongs to the present moment rather than the past. What makes this experience powerful is not that something external is speaking, but that your inner world is active, responsive, and constantly interpreting meaning. The feeling of signal is your awareness catching up with processes that were already in motion beneath it. The idea that the inner world mirrors the outer world comes from the way human perception is never a direct recording of reality, but a continuous interpretation shaped by emotion, memory, and expectation. What you experience outside of you is always filtered through what already exists inside of you. This means that two people can live through the same event and walk away with completely different meanings, because they are not reacting only to the situation itself, but also to the psychological landscape they bring into it. When someone feels as though external life is sending them signs or messages, it often reflects a deeper alignment happening within their own mind. The psyche is constantly organizing experience into patterns that feel meaningful. If there is unresolved longing, unspoken desire, or emotional openness toward connection, the mind becomes more sensitive to cues that seem to confirm that state. A passing coincidence, a remembered name, or a sudden emotional wave can be interpreted as something out there responding, when in reality, it is the inner emotional state becoming visible through interpretation. This mirroring effect becomes especially strong in matters of love and attachment, because relationships activate the most sensitive layers of the psyche. The presence or absence of connection is not just experienced socially, but symbolically. A person who occupies emotional importance in your inner world becomes a kind of reference point for how you interpret neutrality, silence, and coincidence. When the inner world is filled with anticipation or emotional charge, even ordinary moments can appear charged with meaning, as though reality itself is reflecting back what you feel. However, this reflection is not deception. It is how meaning is created. The outer world provides raw material, but the inner world arranges it into significance. The psyche is always seeking coherence, trying to connect emotional dots into a story that feels complete. When there is emotional intensity, especially around attachment or longing, the mind naturally builds bridges between internal feeling and external events. So what feels like the world speaking to you is often your own emotional structure recognizing itself in what you perceive, as if reality and inner experience are momentarily aligned in the same language of feeling and interpretation. The archetype of the soulmate is less about a specific person and more about a deep psychological pattern that represents the human longing for completeness. It arises from the feeling that something essential is missing within the self, and that this missing part might be found or reflected in another person. This is why the idea carries such emotional intensity. It is not simply romantic imagination, but a symbolic expression of inner wholeness seeking recognition. Within the psyche, there is a natural tendency to divide experience into opposites, masculine and feminine qualities, reason and emotion, strength and vulnerability, independence and intimacy. These divisions help structure identity, but they also create a subtle sense of incompleteness. The archetype of the soulmate emerges as an inner image that suggests reconciliation of these opposites. It represents the possibility that what feels fragmented inside can be unified through connection with another being who seems to embody the missing qualities. This does not mean that the soulmate is literally out there as a single destined person. Instead, the psyche projects this inner image onto others who awaken strong emotional resonance. When someone evokes a sense of familiarity, intensity, or deep recognition, it is often because they have touched this inner pattern. The feeling of, "I know you," or "you complete something in me," is the psyche responding to its own internal structure being activated through relationship. At the same time, this archetype evolves through experience. Early in life, it may appear as fantasy or idealization, where perfection is imagined in another person. But as emotional maturity develops, the meaning shifts. The focus gradually moves from finding completion outside to recognizing that the other person is reflecting something already present within. The soulmate archetype then becomes less about dependency and more about awareness, where connection serves as a mirror for inner integration rather than escape from incompleteness. In this sense, encounters that feel deeply significant are not random emotional accidents, but moments where the psyche recognizes its own symbolic language in another person. The intensity of such experiences comes from the feeling that something deeply personal and hidden has been revealed, as if another presence has illuminated a part of the self that was waiting to be seen and understood. Synchronicity of thought and emotion describes those moments when an inner feeling and an external coincidence seem to align so precisely that it feels like meaning has been deliberately arranged. It is the experience of thinking of someone and then encountering something related to them shortly after, or feeling a strong emotional shift that appears to match an external event in a strangely fitting way. What makes it powerful is not the event itself, but the way the mind connects timing, emotion, and significance into a single, unified experience. From a psychological perspective, the mind is always searching for patterns. It is built to link separate pieces of information into coherent narratives, because meaning helps create a sense of orientation in life. When emotion is involved, This pattern seeking becomes even more sensitive. A neutral coincidence can suddenly feel charged when it arrives at the same moment as an emotional state that already holds expectation, longing, or anticipation. The mind does not treat these elements as separate. It fuses them into a single experience of significance. This is why a thought about someone can feel like more than just memory. If the emotional intensity is high enough, the thought itself becomes a focal point, and anything that follows it is interpreted through that emotional lens. The timing creates the illusion of connection between inner and outer events. It feels as though the thought triggered the event or the event responded to the thought, even though both may be independent occurrences that the mind has linked together through meaning-making. Emotion plays a crucial role because it gives weight to perception. Without emotional charge, coincidences remain unnoticed or easily dismissed. With emotional charge, however, even small details can feel profound. The psyche essentially elevates certain experiences into symbols, turning ordinary events into messages that seem personally directed. This symbolic transformation is not random. It reflects the mind's attempt to integrate inner states with external reality in a way that feels coherent and personally relevant. In moments of synchronicity, the boundary between inner experience and outer occurrence feels temporarily softened. Thought and event seem to mirror each other, not because they are causally connected, but because perception has unified them into a single, meaningful pattern shaped by attention, emotion, and timing. Before you continue, pause for a moment and notice. Who came to your mind just now? Don't force it. Don't analyze it. Just observe it. Because the real message is not outside of you. It's in how quickly your heart recognized the name. If this feeling made sense to you, stay with this moment. Because what comes next will explain why certain people never leave your inner world, even in silence. The unconscious communicates in symbols because direct language is too limited to express the full depth of inner experience. Much of what a person feels, desires, fears, or remembers exists beneath conscious awareness, where it is not organized into clear sentences or logical explanations. Instead, it exists as impressions, images, sensations, and emotional tones. When these contents rise toward awareness, they must pass through a kind of translation process, and that translation often appears in symbolic form. A symbol is powerful because it can hold multiple meanings at once, without collapsing them into a single, fixed interpretation. For example, a dream image, a sudden mental picture, or an intense emotional reaction to a memory can carry layers of personal history, unresolved emotion, and present concern all at the same time. The conscious mind tends to prefer clarity and definition, but the unconscious operates in a more fluid and associative way, where meaning is felt rather than explained. This is why inner experiences sometimes feel like messages. A sudden thought about someone, an unexpected emotional shift, or a vivid mental image can feel significant not because it is literally communicating information, but because it condenses a deeper psychological state into a recognizable form. The unconscious does not tell something in a straightforward way. It presents it in a way that must be interpreted through feeling, reflection, and personal association. Symbolic communication also allows the mind to bypass resistance. There are emotions and realizations that a person may not be ready to face directly. In such cases, the unconscious often expresses them indirectly, so they can be approached gradually. This is why meaning can feel hidden or encoded. It is not meant to be obscure for its own sake, but because direct confrontation would overwhelm conscious processing. In everyday life, this symbolic layer is active even when it is not noticed. Intuition, sudden insight, emotional reactions that seem disproportionate, or persistent thoughts about certain people or situations often carry symbolic weight. They are not random disturbances, but structured expressions of inner dynamics trying to reach awareness in a form that the mind can engage with. What feels like a message, therefore, is often the psyche organizing its own internal material into a language of images and emotions, allowing deeper truths to surface without forcing them into rigid explanation. Night changes how the mind processes experience because external stimulation drops and internal awareness becomes more dominant. During the day, attention is constantly pulled outward by tasks, conversations, movement, and sensory input, which keeps emotional processing partially suppressed or delayed. At night, that outward pressure weakens, and the mind naturally turns inward, allowing thoughts and feelings that were previously ignored to surface more easily. This shift makes emotional perception more sensitive. Small thoughts that would normally pass unnoticed can gain intensity simply because there is less competing information. A memory, a passing concern, or the thought of a person can feel amplified, not because it has become more objectively important, but because the mind has fewer distractions to dilute its presence. In this state, attention becomes more concentrated, and concentration magnifies emotional tone. Silence also plays a major role. When the environment becomes quiet, the brain begins to fill that silence with internal content. It starts replaying unfinished emotional material, unresolved interactions, and anticipatory thoughts. This is not random. It is part of the mind's natural tendency to process what could not be fully integrated during active hours. Night becomes a kind of psychological processing space where unstructured feelings attempt to organize themselves. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. At night, the absence of external urgency can create a sense of suspension, where thoughts feel more spacious and less anchored to immediate reality. In that suspended state, imagination and memory blend more easily. A thought about someone can feel vivid enough to resemble presence, not because anything external has changed, but because internal representation becomes more immersive. This is why emotional experiences often feel deeper at night. The same idea or memory that felt mild during the day can suddenly feel significant or even symbolic. The mind is not producing new emotional content. It is simply allowing existing content to rise closer to awareness without interruption. In this condition, perception becomes more reflective, meaning the inner world is more easily mistaken for external influence. The heightened sensitivity is not a sign of outside messages becoming stronger, but of the internal system becoming quieter, allowing emotional material to be felt with greater clarity and intensity. Unspoken love, existing in an energetic form, refers to the way emotional connection does not always require words, actions, or direct contact to be experienced internally. Human beings continuously register emotional impressions of others, not only through communication, but through memory, anticipation, and imagination. When someone becomes emotionally significant, the mind keeps a living internal representation of that person, which continues to operate even in their absence. This internal representation is not static. It carries emotional charge, meaning it can feel warm, distant, intense, or calm, depending on the associations attached to it. When you think of someone you care about, the feeling that arises is not just recall of facts about them, but a reactivation of the emotional state linked to them. In that sense, the connection feels active, even without any external exchange taking place. Because of this, love can feel like it exists beyond direct interaction. The mind continues to simulate relational presence through thought and feeling. It imagines responses, replays memories, and anticipates possibilities. This simulation is not conscious fantasy in a deliberate sense. It is an automatic feature of how attachment works. Emotional bonds do not switch off when distance or silence appears. Instead, they continue to influence inner experience in subtle and ongoing ways. When emotional intensity is high, this internal activity can feel almost tangible. A thought about someone can carry a sense of immediacy, as if the connection itself is being felt rather than simply remembered. This is where the idea of energy becomes a metaphor for psychological continuity. It describes how emotional states persist and circulate within the mind, even without external reinforcement. At the same time, this experience can create the impression of mutuality, as if both people are somehow aware of each other simultaneously. While this feeling is psychologically generated, it reflects a real truth about attachment. Emotional bonds shape perception and attention in ways that make the other person feel present internally, regardless of physical distance. In this sense, unspoken love is not about invisible forces traveling between individuals, but about the persistence of emotional encoding within the mind. The connection lives as long as the inner representation remains active, and it continues to influence thought, mood, and interpretation long after any direct interaction has ended. Awareness transforming perception refers to the way meaning is not fixed in external reality, but continuously shaped by the level of attention and understanding a person brings to their experience. The same event, thought, or emotion can feel ordinary at one moment and deeply significant at another, depending on how conscious a person is of their inner processes. Awareness acts like a lens that changes the clarity and depth with which life is perceived. When awareness is limited, experience tends to be interpreted only at the surface level. Thoughts are taken literally, emotions are felt without reflection, and coincidences are seen as random or disconnected. In this state, the mind reacts quickly but does not always recognize the underlying patterns that connect inner and outer experiences. Meaning remains fragmented because attention is scattered and focused mainly on immediate stimuli. As awareness deepens, perception begins to include not only what is happening externally, but also how it is being experienced internally. A thought is no longer just a thought, it is recognized as a mental event arising from a specific emotional and psychological context. An emotional reaction is no longer just a sudden wave. It is seen as part of a larger pattern of memory, expectation, and inner association. This shift does not change external reality, but it changes how reality is understood. With increased awareness, even subtle experiences gain significance because they are no longer ignored. A passing feeling, a brief thought about someone, or a coincidence in timing can be observed with greater clarity, allowing the mind to notice connections it previously overlooked. This can create the impression that life itself has become more meaningful or responsive, when in reality, it is perception that has become more refined and attentive. This transformation also reduces automatic interpretation. Instead of immediately assigning fixed meanings, the mind becomes capable of holding experiences with more openness, allowing patterns to reveal themselves gradually. Over time, this leads to a sense that inner and outer life are more integrated, not because they have changed structurally, but because perception is no longer dividing them so sharply. In this way, awareness does not add meaning to life. It reveals the meaning already present in the way experience is organized and felt, making perception more continuous, reflective, and consciously connected. What all of this ultimately points toward is not an external mystery sending you hidden messages, but an inner intelligence that is constantly active, shaping how you feel, interpret, and connect meaning to your experiences. The sense of receiving signs, synchronicities, or emotional signals often comes from the depth of your own awareness, interacting with memory, desire, and attention in real time. Nothing is truly random to the mind that is feeling intensely, because emotion naturally organizes experience into patterns that feel purposeful. The idea of a soulmate, of unspoken connection, or of meaningful coincidence becomes powerful because it reflects something real within the human psyche. The need to find coherence between what is felt inside and what is encountered outside. When inner life is emotionally charged, the world appears to respond, not because it is sending coded messages, but because perception is actively interpreting reality through the lens of significance. As awareness grows, the distinction between imagination and perception, memory and presence, or coincidence and meaning, becomes clearer. This does not weaken the experience of connection, it refines it. Instead of searching for signals outside, attention turns toward understanding how deeply the inner world participates in creating those signals in the first place. In the end, what feels like messages before midnight is really the mind becoming more sensitive to itself, more open to its own emotional language, and more aware of the patterns it has always been forming quietly in the background.